So yeah, at a very high level, this was kind of where we started at the beginning of the brainstorming week in May, with already a lot of the requirements being solved, so marked in green, but still a couple of open questions, especially around like how can a column efficiently learn a behavior and observe enough of the changes before they are gone again. Um, how yeah, object distortions was another topic, and also like learning child objects based on movements of parts. And there were a couple of other kind of open questions. And I went through them again today and feel like, at least to myself, I know we haven't really completely agreed on all of those yet, but to my, at least in my internal mental model, I feel like I have solutions to all of these now. Um, they're not like all completely at the point yet where I would feel comfortable with implementing them in Monty, but I think we're getting closer. Um, I guess, yeah, some of the new additions maybe to point out in this key solution space. So I'm not sure if I should go through everything right now. Um, would you find it useful if I go through it all?
Sure.
Okay, so you're not like
Yes, please.
I have to head out in 10 minutes.
No, yeah.
I can't speak for other people.
Okay. So yeah, this part is pretty similar. The general part of how we learn and model an object behavior, which is the behavior models work the same as morphology models, but instead of features at locations, they store changes at locations. And any detected change gets routed to the behavior model as input there for learning and inference. And this kind of is the part that's new from last week, that this can be a different column. Like it doesn't have to be, I can just quickly pull up that one slide again from last week that basically seems like we don't have to have morphology and behavior in the same learning module, but they could be two different learning modules or columns. One of them receives features at locations, the other one receives changes at locations as an input. Their internal mechanics are exactly the same. There's nothing different about how they work. They just receive different input, and because they receive different input, one of them learns a model of morphology and the other one learns a model of behavior.
Well, one big difference is that in the morphology model, you have time to explore the model, explore the object, right? In behavior models, you can move your sensors over the object.
Yeah, so that's a practical difference, I would say, but I
Right.
would say that it changes the internal mechanics of the learning module itself.
Well, maybe, yeah, probably. Well, it's a good starting assumption.
Yeah.
We have to solve the practical problems too.
Yeah, so for the practical problems, I have another bullet point. I'll get to that in just a second. So behavior models don't store information about morphology, which means they can be recognized independently. And they also have their own reference frame, so they can be recognized at different locations, orientations, and scale, using this exact same mechanism as the morphology model. I think we're all pretty familiar with that part, since we talked about it for like since February. But feel free to interrupt if you're unclear. And then behavior models need to have a temporal dimension, since behavior is like kind of unfolding over time. So basically, which point in this behavioral sequence you're in conditions what changes are expected at what locations. And the idea is that the speed of the temporal signal can be sped up or slowed down if changes appear earlier or later than expected, similar as we could, it might be a similar mechanism as we could use for scale, or adjusting orientation. And this point in sequence conditioning mechanism, so basically having some conditioning on what to expect at which locations, could also be used in morphology models to encode different states, like also using kind of input to layer one to condition, for example, different keyframes of a morphology, different morphological states of the same object. That's a kind of a proposal I made, yeah, some time ago, some research meeting ago, that like this kind of layer one temporal input could in morphology models be substituted by state conditioning for keyframes, or it could be even in behavior models, it might not always be a strict time code. It could also be something that's action conditioned, like a sequence of changes you go through, depending on when you apply certain actions.
Remember in our compositional model, layer one is also used for hierarchical composition. So I think that the general would be that the layer one inputs, there are multiple layer one inputs, and there's evidence that they're segregated. So it doesn't have to be one or the other, I guess I'm saying.
Yeah, right, yeah. Okay, and then, yeah, to the kind of practical aspects of being able to learn a behavior fast enough. One of the solutions we talked about during the brainstorming week was that we would first learn very coarse models and interpolate between points. And then over time, we can add more points for more accurate predictions. So that's one mechanism to be able to quickly have like a very rough approximation of a behavior and make some rough predictions. Even if you haven't observed like all of the locations in all of the temporal points in the sequence. And then we can also use efficient policies to move to observed changes. So like whenever you see something moving, you saccade there and observe that change. And then also we could leverage compositionality. So basically having movement of a child object as one point in the behavior model instead of all of the points on the child object. And then during inference, we can leverage voting. So when we try to infer a behavior, we could do that rather quickly if we can vote. And one thing we discussed around that is that we would also want to vote on the state. So the layer one input. So vote on where in the sequence we are or which keyframe of the morphology model we are observing. And then, yeah, to the kind of requirement of learning associations between object models and behavior models. A main solution we discussed is that a behavior ID and pose can be associated with locations on a morphology model using hierarchy. So basically, the behavior ID becomes a feature on the parent morphology object because we talked about that, like basically you can associate behaviors on any location in arbitrary locations, orientations, and scales on an object, and an object can have multiple behaviors at different locations, and that's basically exactly describing what hierarchy can do for us. So it seems like that could be a natural mechanism to use.
It seems you need a little bit more than this. I mean, a behavior, I mean, when we do compositionality, we associate the behavior ID going forward up the hierarchy, and we associate locations going backward in the hierarchy. And you need to have the location assignments. It seems to me like a behavior has to not just, we can't just say, oh, there's a behavior at this location. We also have to be able to say, it's like a compositional object. It's like saying, okay, well, the object, I have to assign the entire behavior space to the parent. You know what I'm saying? Like it's like a child object, the behavior. And so it's not just an ID, it's going to be a set of locations.
Yeah. So yeah, it would be exactly the same mechanism as we use for associating child objects with parent objects. So the child object ID would exist on multiple locations on the parent object. And there are also feedback connections that tell you that if you're on a certain location on the parent object, expect to be at a certain location in the behavior.
Right, so that you didn't say that here in your text. Here you say feedback connections can bias expected behavior. Um,
Yeah.
but that'd be more like the projection to layer one, the back projection to layer one. But this is interesting. This brings up the possibility that by separating these two out, I need to have sort of two set of hierarchical set of connections. I might have to have a set of connections that have a hierarchy between a parent object and a child object, and then a parent object and a child behavior. And these are different columns. Um, if they're different columns, I have to establish that feed forward and feedback connections in two separate places. Like imagine
Yeah.
that my behavioral column is off to the left and my morphology columns are off to the right. A parent has to make associations. It might have to make associations between its locations. It's a morphology object would make associations between its locations and locations on the child behavioral object.
Yeah, so
It,
you mean like if you have if the parent column is a model of a car, it would have associations to the model of the tire, the morphology model of the tire, but also associations to the behavior model of spinning.
right, right. So and if there's separate locations for those two learning modules, like columns, then I have to make double sets of connections.
Yes.
And that was really reliant on yeah, okay.
You
That's
would need double sets of connections if they were in the same column as well, because you have to associate with unique locations in the behavior reference frame and the morphology reference frame, but now they are in
all
more
right,
physically separate locations.
right. Okay, good point. But it's something to be thoughtful of. It's extra
Yeah.
connections. It's like it's some and we have they have to be those connections have to be co-locations in space. Imagine these behavioral columns were in MT, for example. This means that a column in V1 or V2 or whatever that is representing some point in the retina has to connect to a column in MT that's currently at the same location. I'm not even sure if that works.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. It seems like it, I'm not sure if there are any kind of feed forward type connections from MT to V1 to be able to associate behaviors with a model in V1. It might be that just,
and feedback connections too.
yeah, it might be that
Yeah,
just only associate behaviors with models that are more in like V4.
maybe
Um,
I don't know.
yeah,
Regardless of where you are in the hierarchy, we just have to think about the mechanisms of these connections and can they exist?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's a good point. Um, but yeah, so the general idea there would be that the feed-forward connections can bias the object based on recognized behavior, and then feedback connections can bias the expected behavior based on a recognized object. And you can learn associations between the two that way. Um, and then we had this big questions around making predictions about an object at arbitrary points in a behavioral sequence. Um, so there, one of the bigger ideas that came out recently was that object behaviors could be applied to morphology using, I'm not sure anymore if it would require a hierarchy, but basically sending movement commands to the morphology's reference frame. So the column that recognized the behavior could send the inverse of the movement that's stored in its model to the morphology's reference frame. And then that movement is applied to move the expected location in the object's reference frame the same way that a physical movement would be applied, like a movement of the sensor. And then a change in the child's objects or the morphology object's orientation relative to the parent can be applied to the like layer 6B pose hypothesis. Um, I'm actually part of my questions later will be if that's even still required, but um,
Why wouldn't it be? I mean, you seem to care a lot about it before.
because I think with this new idea of separating the columns and having the ability to have a separate feature and morphology model as well, we could model object distortions. I'll get to that in a
But I
moment.
mean, you still think we need to predict what an object might look like due to behavior, right? Or are you
Yes.
saying, okay, I thought you said we didn't need to do that anymore.
Yeah, so basically, the remaining part of this slide is making a proposal of how what we talked over the past weeks about could solve object distortions. And that's a bit of a different mechanism than applying movement to the reference frame. I think we
Mm-hmm.
still need to apply movement to the reference frame for like compensating for movement of the entire object, like when a car drives by or a ball flies through the air. We still need to compensate for movement of the whole object. But I'm wondering now if that requires a behavior model or if that could be something that's more of a model-free mechanism that just detects kind of movement in the world and uses
Mm.
that to compensate for it. Like, I'm not sure if it would require a whole model since it's basically
Well, we
considered
talked about having
behavior.
an object that a different type of stapler that looked very different in many ways, and yet to try to imagine what it looked like when it was open. Um, and that seems to be less about that seems to be very specific prediction.
Um, yeah,
I don't know.
maybe I'll get back to it after I go through the
Yeah, okay, okay.
those of object deformations. Um, but yeah, so I still like this idea. I think applying movement to that object's reference frame to compensate for object movement will still be relevant. The only thing I'm questioning is if it needs to come from a behavior model or if it could be more of a model-free detected signal. But I think that's a good point that a model-free detected signal wouldn't work if we're just doing kind of a mental simulation or thinking through how it would look like.
Yeah, it seems like it would be model based, but not model free. But I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Uh, I left it in here, so we might still need it in general. Um, and then, yeah, another point we discussed is that if an object stops moving, we will learn morphology again. So it would basically be we often call it keyframes. So if you have the stapler, you learn the stapler morphology, then the stapler opens. While it's opening, you're sending changes to the behavior model. You're not learning anything in the model of the stapler morphology, but then it stops when it's open. There's no change detected anymore. So you would send features to the morphology model again and basically learn a different state of that object. Um, and yeah, one thought around that was also that different object states can be associated with different points in a behavioral sequence. So if you're recognizing the sequence of your model of it, that could there could be an associative connection kind of priming to expect to see the morphology model of the open stapler
Hmm.
next. Um, and then I'll talk through that in a moment. Um, another thing we
Why
talked
did?
about.
Okay. Oh, okay. Never mind. Oh, wait.
Okay. Yeah, one other thing we talked about is that the solutions above automatically also cover recognizing moving objects. So like compensating for object movement using the parent behavior model, like when the entire object is moving through space, and physics, like the behavior model would just be applied to pretty much all objects, behavior of falling or something like that. And then a last point was around learning child objects based on movement of parts, like segmenting the stapler into a top and bottom part after you saw that it can move. And so something we talked around there was that when we first see the stapler move, we could be applying a kind of attentional mask that could be based on model-free signals, like areas of movement, and we only make predictions on the moving parts of the morphology, so only on the top of the stapler. And then over time, that masked area could be learned as a separate child object. And yeah, I'm still not 100% sure on all of the details here. Like this is one of the parts where I wouldn't be confident in implementing it. But yeah, we spend a lot of time talking about attentional masks and segmenting. So I wanted to include it here.
I think we kind of reached the first part of this, that we would use an attentional mask is almost a derived necessity. It's like there doesn't seem to be any other way of doing it. It wasn't like, oh, this is one way. It seemed like, no, it seemed like it had to be that, had to do this.
Yeah.
But the over time part is not clear. That's necessity. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that was related to the question of like how do we segment an object into its components if we observe them kind of moving independently or independently. So yeah, maybe that's still an open question. The
Maybe,
attentional mask was just the best mechanism I could think of for that.
Can I ask you what the light green one, 2 lines above means? If multiple child objects move independently relative to the parent, object distortions. Is that like the T-shirt example or something like that? What were you thinking of that one?
Yeah, the T-shirt or the exploding logo or the inflating balloon or the squishing ball.
Well, like Rami's exploding logo, that they didn't move independently. They had a fixed. They moved, but they always moved in the same way, right?
Yeah, with independently, I mean they don't all move in the same direction and
Well,
speed.
right, but even his, it was a repeatable pattern. We could learn that if we really
Yeah.
focused on it. It's not like they were one part's really independent of the others, or just. So I'm trying to understand that if the word
Yeah,
move
so I'm
move
not saying
indifferent.
you can't learn it. I'm saying you can learn it, and it is a fixed pattern. It's just that the individual features on the object are moving in different directions, so the whole arrangement of features changes. It's not like you could just apply that movement vector to the child reference frame, because the whole arrangement has changed.
But then you say, for example, object distortions. I mean, the exploding logo is not object distortion. What did you mean by that?
I would say it's a type of object distortion.
To me, distortions usually imply like like I'm applying some just learned change, not like exploding logo to me doesn't seem like an object distortion. That seems like a new thing. Okay, well, we don't have to resolve that here.
Yeah, I guess object distortion is the term the best term I could come up with to describe this, that the features on the object are changing in different directions. It's not like all of the points on the stapler top are moving in the same direction together.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
that they move in like different ways.
Well, a distortion, one way to think about distortions is that the map of the object is locally always consistent, but globally changing. That's how I would think of distortions. Like in the T-shirt example, that's a distortion because locally on the T-shirt, the relative position of any two parts of the T-shirt are still near each other. They're not moving around independently. Where the logo is like your T-shirt exploded into lots of different parts and went all over the place. That would be different. I wouldn't call that a distortion. But
Yeah, so maybe distortions are one example of that. I
okay.
guess basically anything where it's not the entire child object moving in a consistent way, but the child object itself is kind of changing its shape.
Okay. Well, the language there was tripping me up. The independently and the distortions, those are, I think we need better language for that. To talk about exactly what we're talking about. Because
Yeah.
I think the exploding logo is quite different than the crumpled t-shirt. I don't think they're the same at all.
Yeah.
Wow, what the hell happened there? All those lines appeared.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's what I don't like about Excalibur. The arrows do like weird stuff.
What are those arrows? Oh, I
And
see. What happened to them all? Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Um,
That's definitely not, that's definitely a logo exploding there. Okay.
oh no, now the open questions are gone.
Oh no, can you just back
Controls
up?
E equals
Oh man, that's so annoying. Why would
What happened?
Excalibur do that? I know you can't really reverse these arrows, but I don't know why the open questions disappeared.
Mm.
Anyways, I have them written down in hand notes too, so um, I can write them again. All right, if I can't reverse it, I can at least make the text right. Okay. Anyways, all of the key solutions correspond to some of those requirements. Was the point I was trying to make. And so now I will just briefly go over like why I even thought of putting morphology and behavior models into separate columns and how that came about. And it all kind of comes back to modeling object distortions. So hopefully it will make more sense. So I don't know if you remember a while ago, I think in June, I showed this example here of a circle turning into an oval, kind of like a ball that's being squished or something. And there are basically two options for modeling this deformation or behavior, which is either you can learn separate models, separate morphology models for each variation of that shape. And oh, I should mention, this is just about making predictions of the morphology. You would, like if you're observing it change that shape, you would still independently learn a behavior model of that. So that's not shown here. So for making predictions about these two morphologies, you
I'm
could
sorry,
either,
so this is a circle changing into an oval.
yes.
And, okay. So we're observing, is it bouncing back again, or is it just like a one-time change, or is it like a bouncing ball, or is it, how are you envisioning this?
I guess it can, it oscillates between the two. It doesn't really matter.
Okay,
But
all right, so we're not, so, but there's a lot of in-between, shapes between the circle and the oval. We're just showing two endpoints here.
yeah, and let's say it kind of stops moving when it's in the circle shape and it stops moving when it's in the oval shape.
Okay,
So one option is we learn separate models for those two shapes, basically like two keyframes of the object. The other option is to only learn a morphology model of the circle and then learn how to distort the circle. So how to map the features of the circle to new locations in the circle's reference frame. And yeah, I kind of thought a lot about this option and have a bunch more visualizations on that in old Excalibur boards. But basically, both of these options would require to learn kind of two maps, either two morphology maps or one morphology map and one distortion map. So you'd have to learn an equal amount of distortion models as we would have to learn morphology models. But the kind of advantage of distortion maps I thought of was that it helps a lot when we start applying the same distortion to different models. So you could imagine applying that kind of squishing distortion to a striped ball and to a yellow ball with the Thousand Brains logo on it. And that distortion would just tell us how all of the features on that object, even if it's like a compositional object with a logo on it, it would tell us how all of those distort. But then I was thinking, well, all of those objects would still have the same morphology model underlying. We're only changing the features on the object, like color and child objects. So I was wondering if that could just be solved by separating morphology and feature models. So if the morphology ID and reference frame is independent of the features on the object, then we can just learn the circle and oval morphology model, so option 1, and then apply different feature maps to those morphologies. So yeah, basically learn multiple morphology models and then map objects onto different morphologies. But yeah, mapping features onto those morphologies using hierarchy feature maps.
I mean, a better example of this is the logo on the mug where it wraps around, right?
Yeah,
Because here, I don't know, this might be just a new logo. You know, I don't. I could imagine that oval with the squish logo or with the non-squish logo, and
well, yeah, I guess I was thinking here, like, let's say I give you a ball with the Thousand Brains logo on it, and then I ask, what would you expect it to look like if I squish the
yeah,
ball, the
yeah,
balloon, and you would expect the logo to kind of distort
right, right.
in a
But
certain
in
way.
terms of inferring, like just showing me one of these things, it's
Yeah, you
like
don't
when you
know.
showed the very top of this, you had a circle and the oval. When I first saw them, I saw them as two separate things. I didn't see the oval as being a squash circle. I said, oh, there's a circle and an oval. They're two separate objects. I recognize them differently. And yet then I said, oh, but if I see them transforming between each other, that's something different.
Yeah, yeah. So here I'm assuming that we see them transform between each other, so we know it's the same object, but different states of the same object.
Mhm.
Um, so that kind of got me thinking more about how could we separate morphology and feature models more from each other and learn them separately so we can apply the same features onto different morphologies, like wrap the logo around the cup and put the logo on a baseball hat and put the logo on a t-shirt and on a ball and everything. Um, and I kind of realized that it would be pretty simple to learn a 2D surface model and then wrap that around 3D models. We would basically use exactly the same mechanism as we use for morphology models. We would just change the kind of movement input we get to be movement along the surface instead of movement in three-dimensional space. So for the morphology model, we would store orientations at locations, and those locations would be in metric space of the sensor, so in like a three-dimensional space. And the transformation in the thalamus would be movement relative to the sensor to movement relative to the object. Um, but then for the surface model, we could store features at locations. Features could be like color or child object IDs, for example.
So I'm going to interrupt here. I'm still uncomfortable with this idea of separating out these surface models from morphology models. And only because I can think of counterexamples, or seems like I can think of counterexamples. You know, I can take a mug and I can change its color. Oops, I lost my earbuds are dead. Hang on a sec. Um, just going to my speaker here. Hear me still? Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Yes? No?
Yeah. Yep.
Oh gosh. Um, Still there? Can you guys hear me at all?
Yeah.
Yep. Can you hear us?
Just wondering, can you guys hear me if I don't use my AirPods?
Yeah.
Okay.
No. Just kidding.
Good answer. It's like, raise your hand if you're dead.
Why can't I hear you? Like, you can't hear me, right?
I can.
No, you can hear me.
Hear
Yes, you
you.
can hear me? I
Yes.
just can't hear you. Okay.
Okay.
Let's well, give me one more second here.
Oh yeah, my earbuds also
It's a
dead.
speaker. I have it on the soundwire class. Sorry. Microphone, SoundWire, audio class, SoundWire, audio class. So I don't know why the speakers are not working. Let me do this.
I guess the time at which the earbuds die is the signal to wrap up the research meeting.
Still not working here, huh? I'm gonna do one more thing and then I'll just like I'm gonna test. Yes, okay. Hello, hello, hello.
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 Right, I hear y'all now. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Oh, I just did the test and it fixed it. Okay, sorry about that. I probably need to get new earbuds. That after about 2.5 hours they die. So I'm not
Same.
sure.
Which was why I was also doing a sound check.
Is that normal or my battery's gotten worse? I don't know.
I don't know. I think my earbuds are also getting a little bit old. But
Yeah, I don't remember when they're brand new. I don't remember running out on me, but now they run out about 2 hours and 20 minutes.
Don't do like noise canceling or any of those like special things. It'll last longer.
But I like that.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
Okay. I was saying I'm not really super comfortable with this separating out surface models from morphology models. I can think of morphology models and having flavors of morphology models that don't really require a separate model for the surface. Like maybe it's just a color or a gradated color. It goes from dark green at the top to light green at the bottom. I don't think that's a surface model. I don't think I have a reference frame for that. But it feels like I ought to be able to assign attributes to the locations on the morphology model that that are not represented in a separate surface model.
But isn't that kind of an argument for separating out the morphology? Like
Why?
morphology
No,
is
well, I always felt that there was a way of doing that in a single. Maybe I don't. I said I always thought there was a way of doing that using the single neural mechanism.
We always separated it in the mini columns versus the
Well,
specific.
the mini columns represented the morphology model, right? But then the individual cells in the mini column would represent the different features. So I would have in one, that was the beauty of it, that the mini columns themselves define the morphology. And therefore, within that morphology, I got to have lots of different features expressed and still can maintain the same mini columns. So there's a double layer of representation there between mini columns and cells, and therefore in the same model, I would have both.
Yeah, but it would also mean that you'd have to relearn the logo or whatever pattern you have on the surface for every shape.
Well, no, because that's compositionality. So I agree when I'm putting the logo on there, I have a separate model for the logo. You can call it a surface model, but it's a child object called the logo. And I can apply that to a parent object called the cup. That was the compositional structure. And so we have to do that, but there seems to be, instead of having a whole logo, it seems like it could also be just assigned some attributes like color or temperature or other things that don't fit into a surface model.
Yeah, but even then, even with just a color, it seems like you'd have to store a lot more because you have to store the color on all of the locations on the object. Versus if we have like a very simple surface model of color, it would, how I was thinking of it, would basically just be that there's almost no location representation. Basically, any movement would predict the same color. And so it's like a very simplistic model. You can make it a bit more complex if you have like a pattern, like a checkerboard pattern. You
Yeah.
have local movements that
Well, I
change.
guess would I have to learn a surface model of green by looking at, a big area and noticing every feature is green? I don't think so. I don't think I have to learn it that way.
Yeah, so I think it would be easier to do that with the surface model if you would, otherwise if you have it as part of the cup's
Yeah, but I guess
morphology, you
I'm
have to
saying
look
I
at
don't even
all
think
the locations.
I don't think I even learned it. Would be easier, but I don't think I do it that way. I don't think so here's a new color I've never seen before. I have to like look at, you see it all over the place. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm still uncomfortable with this.
Yeah, but isn't that a problem? Isn't that a bigger problem if it's part of the morphology model? Because then you have to
so
learn it.
I'm not happy with either solution. Right? I don't think we have a good solution for this. I'm just thinking, I don't think surface models. I think the idea that we have, the idea that the logo wraps around the mug, I think we solved that in some ways with the compositional structure.
Yeah.
Maybe, and so then I don't call it a surface model though. It's a compositional structure. So I guess I don't feel we have a good enough handle on what these this solution makes me uncomfortable. I'm just telling you that.
Okay, I guess, yeah, we have a solution for the logo, learning how the logo wraps around the cup, but it doesn't really solve predicting a new logo and how that would wrap around the cup if you haven't learned the associations yet.
Right. All right. Agree. I'm not happy with it, but on the other hand, I don't think just calling it coming up with a new brand of model.
Well,
Anyway, that's
The way that I was thinking, sorry, just really quickly was not necessarily surface, but so everything says orientation location, features allocations, changes allocations. So there is some, like, I'm thinking about like the kind of the shape, the mug in each of these models, but it's just that at each location, we're just storing different kinds of information. That's all,
yeah,
like, it's not really a
right. But
surface.
like,
yeah. So they're extremely similar. We're just varying the input to those.
right. So, but let me just step back for a second. We were trying to do this all in one learning module, all in one column. And we went down that path, and just recently, Viviane suggested, hey, maybe we should separate out the behavior models. All right. And I thought that requires a lot of thought, because that's a big change. And so let's give it a lot of thought before we do that. Now it just seems like we've done that. Let's throw out another change. Now let's create a third type of model, a surface model, right? Well, what the hell? That makes it easy. And then it breaks some other stuff, and I'm not sure it solves all the problems. So it feels too, I just don't think we have enough clarity on this problem to make this, I guess, it feels to me like, okay, this is an interesting proposal, but I'm not happy with it yet. Just putting it that way. It's got too many things that jump in my head. Like, oh no, this doesn't sound like a good idea. Where the behavior model, I can probably see that a bit better.
Yeah, so I was thinking of it's basically there could be a whole range of models types of models we could categorize, but basically it's always the same mechanism. It's just the columns get different types of input, so they learn different.
I understand that, but now when you have a whole bunch of different model types, there's all these complications about how they communicate with each other. How do they share locations and orientation, and how do they vote, and where are they? And you introduce another complexity, a level of complexity that I'm scared of.
Yeah, I guess we have that already anyways with like higher level modules getting like compositional input and therefore learning compositional models or different.
No, with the compositionality, I don't think introduced any new type of, it was it wasn't a new type of model. It was the same models. It just we're connecting them. We didn't introduce new types of models in that case.
Well,
Yes,
I
there
guess
was a
I'm just saying, when I say type of model, I'm not saying that anything inside the column is different. It's just what it's modeling is different. So
I
you
know,
could
but it
call
means that
the
they're
compositional
physically
model
they're
a different
physically
type.
different columns. They have to be physically located someplace in the brain. They have to be physically different, and therefore the whole brain can be thought of. The neocortex is called columns and how they connect. Right. So if we put everything into one column, we have this beautiful architecture, and then the connectivity is simpler. If we start breaking out the different types of columns, then your connectivity gets more complex. And I'm registering I am uncomfortable with this one right now. For various reasons I don't think we have time to get into right now. But I'm just I'm registering my vote like, maybe. I'm not very happy about this.
Yeah. Because my argument is they're in the same way different types of models as we have like visual models and tactile models and compositional models and abstract language
Well,
model.
Well,
So
no, we don't have every column does the way we don't have compositional. Every column is a compositional model. Every single one. There is no non-compositional models in my
well,
mind.
we have models that have object IDs from other columns as features. So they model.
But in my mind, they're all the same. Like V1, V2, V4, they're all doing none of them have. It's not like they all work on the same principle, and you connect them the way they're connected, you get compositionality. They're not separate
Yeah,
types
and
of
I'm
models.
saying those are also all the same, and they're just again like you can get auditory input or visual input, you can get feature
Well,
input.
visual input and auditory input make no difference. Those columns are nothing. It's all exactly the same. But now these are three different types of columns here because they just have to be treated differently, right? I've been trying not to treat these different
I
models
guess
differently.
yeah. What I'm arguing is that they don't have to be treated differently. They would be
Well, they have to
treated
be treated differently
the
in how
same.
they connect to each other. I can't connect them. I have to know there's differences. How the behavior models connect to morphology models is not the same as how morphology models connect to morphology models. I mean, or at least it's more complex.
No, it is pretty much the same. Behaviors are also associated on a location by location basis to morphologies. Same as the
Right. But I
morphology.
have to now have separate areas of the brain that do these things and connect them. Anyway, I'm okay with the behavior one, morphology one. I'm not happy with the surface models yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is I guess how
I
I
mean,
first
the
thought of
logo.
separating the two, because it's just kind of a history of how I thought of that, because I first thought of surface models and it was like we can't have three reference frames in one column. So like, is there even a requirement?
Why do I need a reference? I'm still confused a little bit. Why I'm not convinced I need another reference frame for like if it's the logo on the cup, I don't. It's just a compositional structure.
But it wraps around the cup. So it's like,
Yeah, but we use the morphology of the cup and assign the location of the logo on each point, and therefore I'm not relying on the morphology of the logo. I'm only relying on the morphology of the cup, and I can assign the logo at each point.
yeah, so I guess what I'm trying to solve with this is it would still be the same mechanism of associating the logo with the mug, but it would generally work with any logo, knowing how it would wrap around the cup, even if we haven't learned the associations yet.
I guess this surface model to me just looks like another model. If it's a logo, it's just a two-dimensional model. I don't see.
It is just another model.
So why do I call it something different? It's the logo has features at orientations and locations, and it's like every other thing. It has its own morphology.
Right. So I guess the key idea here was that the movement input is different. So instead of movement relative to the object in three-dimensional space, the input would be movement relative to the surface in two-dimensional space. So although we're moving along like a curved surface on the mug, movement would just be like up, down, left, right, as if it was like a 2D plane. And that way we can predict any kind of pattern that's wrapped around the cup because we're just moving in surface space and not in three-dimensional space.
Now I have different movement vectors now because I have a movement vector that's in three-dimensional space.
Yeah.
And the same egocentric motion vector has to be converted into a two-dimensional space and a three-dimensional space. And
Yeah.
you know, this reminds me of the whole idea that when we look at the world, everything is distorted. Like, you know, I'm looking out my window and I can see a picnic table. Well, I think of the picnic table as a rectangle, but from my point of view here, it's a very weird, skewed parallelogram, you know? Or if I look at a round plate, it becomes a flattened, you know, oval. It's related, it seems related to that problem. Of the problem of, you know, we build these like sort of projected maps of objects, or even our map of even our map of an environment or room is like a top-down projection. But when we're looking at the room, we never see it that way. It just seems related. I'm just sharing brain thoughts here. All right, let's keep going. I'm registering my uncomfortableness.
I have a bit of a higher level observation. It feels to me that whenever we're thinking of generalizing something or abstracting some kind of information from our models, we tend to want to split that into a different column. Like when we abstract, for example, a behavior that could be applied to multiple different models, we want to abstract that into a column. And when we talk about a logo that can be applied to different other objects, we also want to do that. And then we bounce back and forth between the idea whether they should be applied compositionally or just in a different column at the same region.
I didn't follow that. I didn't follow that last sentence.
Sometimes we say that because it's a behavior that can be applied to different models, we tend to say, okay, maybe it should be applied in a compositional way, where it's at a different region, and then we apply it to different models.
Just remember, this is all new. We haven't been doing this for a long time. So this whole idea that bringing out the behavioral models separately is a new idea. It's not like we've been doing this a lot. You know, you start off saying, "Oh, whenever we have a new idea, we bring it out." Like, oh,
no, I mean, like we've talked about whether the behavior model should be in a different, whether it's at a different level, so that we can tie it to different objects in a compositional way, or it should be in a different column in the same region, and
right,
associated with different models. I'm just saying that. It feels like it's very appealing because of the like the source. This is why it's very appealing. It's because we want to associate that abstracted knowledge onto different specific instances of whatever we abstracted it from. And I think that there might be a way of like if we take that to the extreme, we would probably want to say we want to build a different model for everything for every abstracted knowledge that we want to do, like maybe abstracting away the rotation or the scaling of an object. We want to build like a rotation concept outside in a different model that we can apply to in a different column that we could apply to every model that we have. I just think that.
But don't you think that's dangerous? Because then you end up with it's like.
No, I agree with you. I'm with you, Jeff, on this. I feel like separating when we abstract some knowledge so that we can apply it to different models, that's dangerous, because every time we want to abstract something that could be attached to multiple specific objects, it's dangerous because we end up with many different columns that are just doing these little different things. So I guess.
But why would, I mean, we have many different columns that could be doing different things, but I mean, even when we had the the behavior and morphology model within the same column, we still applied them by having one column recognize the morphology and the other one the behavior, and have them hierarchically arranged. So it's not like we ever used within column connections for any associations between those.
I think that the generalization usually it needs to come from it used to be it needs to be extracted from a single column and it would be represented in a single column. The way that we apply it to different objects would also probably happen in the same column. I don't know.
I mean, having both the behavior and morphology model active at the same time within a column and then having connections between the two within the same column?
Yes.
Would you say that sentence again, Viviane?
So basically going back to this one where we have the behavior and the morphology model within the same learning module, and then to apply them, we have connections between the two within the same learning module. Whereas even before, when we talked about them being in the same model, we still used hierarchy to associate them with each other. So we would say that in the child
Yeah.
column, the morphology is being recognized in the
Well,
parent
that's
column.
where we started from, remember, right? We originally started with they're in the same column and they're working in the same column, and then we had problems with that. And then we decided to do it.
But we don't we have the same problem with extracting away something like the rotation of an object and applying it to different objects, to different models. We have that rotation in layer 6B, and it's
Right. Well,
abstract
there's
from the object.
I mean, there's some, the thing about the brain is it's not like this pure mathematical formalism, right? It's kind of a mess. It's a system that evolved to solve a set of problems. And so we're looking for common principles everywhere that are universal, really elegant principles. And yet it won't be all beautiful. There's going to be some, hacks that nature put in there that are required. So we're just when we're having this conversation, we're bouncing back and forth between elegant universal principles and hacks. That's the way I view it. And and it's going to have a bit of both. So why am I pointing this out? Is we do know we have some elegant principles that learning modules, Cortex does Cortex, and Viviane's trying to keep that, even she proposed 3 different types of models. We also know that we have a lot of knowledge about the connectivity of the brain, hierarchical and non-hierarchical connectivity. And so we have we came up with a really elegant solution for the compositional structure that applies in a hierarchy. And I feel really comfortable about that. I don't think that's a new type of abstraction. It's just, that's an inherent property thing. I think separating out behaviors from morphology it made me nervous at first, because that's like, where do we have evidence for that? And I've argued, well, maybe that's a hack that nature figured out, but putting them over in like the where columns versus the what columns, something like that. But now, but these kind of things here, like putting them both in the same module, that was an elegant solution, but it didn't seem to work. Why am I bringing this all up? I just feel we have to be really careful about deviating from what we have right now without very careful thought. And I don't see these all equivalent. I think the compositional structure that's a really elegant. I feel solid about that. Separating out the learning the behavior is less solid, but it's worth exploring for a while, because Viviane's made good arguments for it. And then I think these other things, like now we're talking about those surface models, that seems like, well, that's like a whole nother thing that I don't have any biological support for. Where is it? What's the evidence for it? It got other problems. I don't know.
So,
Sorry.
I guess
sharing.
in my mind, this is the very elegant solution, and this is the hacky solution, because we keep the exact same learning module, and there aren't just 3 types of models. There are many types. There are just many different inputs that a learning module
All
could
right, if I can,
receive.
if
There
you
could
can
be
show
visual
me,
models and touch.
but here's the thing, Viviane. If you can show me, if I have all these different learning modules, but how they're connected is going to be the same no matter what type of learning modules they are. That is, I'm not there yet. I don't think you've made that case.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's how I'm thinking of it. They're all connected the same way, all using hierarchy to compose and associate with each other. And
so how do they vote
even
together?
the same learning module, the difference is the sensor module that plugs into them. The learning modules are the exact
Right,
same.
How would the brain know to create a feature model versus a behavior model versus morphology? I mean, a feature
It
model is,
doesn't. It just receives different input.
well, someone has to, okay, well, where's that different input coming from? Do I have it in the behavior model? It's easy to imagine. I can imagine the magnocellular pathway. But when it
Yeah.
comes to features in morphology, I don't have a separate thing like that.
Well, I was proposing that it could be like the blobs and interblobs, for example. That
Well,
the-
that's so they're getting the same input, but because coming from the retina or coming from the thalamus, I don't have two separate streams coming in. So what you then be arguing is that I take the same stream, let's say the parvocellular pathway, and I internally process it differently. Like internally, the cortex knows, oh, I'm going to route these over here and calculate surface models, and we're going to route these over here and calculate morphology models. That's possible.
Yeah, that's how it kind of looks like, because there are these clear separations. There are like blobs and interblobs, and then in V2 we have the.
So then I'm
thick
asking myself,
stripe and
okay,
tail
what
stripe.
does the mini column represent in a morphology model, and what does it represent in a feature model? And what do the individual cells represent in a morphology model, and individual cells represent in a feature model?
Yeah, so that's what I proposed here, that in both of them, the mini columns are orientations. And then for the morphology model, the individual cells could be curvature magnitude, for example, like the amount of curvature sensed. And then for the feature maps, it could be like color or child object ID or temperature or something like that. And then, so this is almost the same. The main difference would be that the movement.
But somewhere in the column, because it's not happening in the thalamus, somewhere in the column, there has to be a different algorithm that says, okay, I'm interested in curvature, and the other column says, no, I'm not interested in curvature.
No, I mean, you could even have columns that receive 3D movement and color. The mechanism would always be the same. The column doesn't know, it just does the same thing. It's only.
But why would if they're both getting, I'm passing in parvocellular pathway, and it's just a bunch of axons, and one column's going to calculate curvature from that, and the other one's going to calculate a color, object, temperature. I mean, how does one know to do one and one knows to do the other?
The column doesn't calculate it, it just gets it as input.
No, but the input's coming from the thalamus. All I've got is a parvocellular pathway. These are center surround axons. That's all I got. I got nothing else. It's the same input.
So it just does spatial pooling on whatever patterns it gets as input.
But why would one sort of settle in one domain and the other settle in another domain?
It's
I
just
can see,
based on the connectivity that it started with.
but we're putting words on these things. I need a learning algorithm would just say, I would rather you say, no, this column here is determining curvature.
I guess that's where I see the elegance in this, is that the learning module, the column, is agnostic to it. In Monty, we would use the same learning module for all of these models.
Right, but at the moment, right now, we're burdening in this picture in the biology, we're burdening the column to figure things out. The column itself has to figure out if it's more going to determine curvature versus non-curvature. The column itself has to figure out whether I'm going to be determining 3D versus 2D. They're all getting the same input because they're all getting the same input.
This one receives three-dimensional movement input. This one receives.
But if look at the thalamus in biology, we don't have that separation. Where's that coming from? I mean, I got two pathways: the parvocellular pathway and the magnocellular pathway. I don't have 4 different pathways.
It could be something that only starts in V2, for example, where like certain extra information is extracted from the movement in layer 4B, for example, like stereo information or shape-based.
Okay, all right. Well, again, we're burdening the cortex to figure this out. That's my point. I'm not against that.
Well,
I'm just saying.
Maybe we are burdening V1 to do a bit of pre-processing and special routing, but V1 is special region anyways with
Okay,
more
well
layers.
then let's state that as the hypothesis. It's not a generic algorithm everywhere. We would say, oh, there's extra computation that goes on in the cortex that's not part of the generic algorithm. And that extra computation we can think of as the laminar layers in, you know, in V1, the extra layer 4s. And then they're going to be calculating certain things. And after that calculation, then columns are columns.
Right,
But
yeah.
in V1, they're not. In V1, we're saying, oh no, V1 is doing some very special things that are not generic.
Yeah, kind of
I'm
like
okay with
the
that.
paper
That-
here said that V1 acts as a clearinghouse of basic visual measurements, distributing information appropriately to higher cortical areas.
Right. You know, look, I've said many times that I've been very uncomfortable not knowing what this thing is going on. I've thrown out some ideas about it. So I'm open to this. I just think we need to acknowledge that and say that this is something that has to occur that is not in our current models. It's not in our theory right at the moment. That Cortex is doing this, parsing and creating new sets of classes of data that now a generic column could process. I'm okay with that. We just need to state that. So you've got it here. That's
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to show last week, that basically, okay, we have the separate magnetar and parvicella pathways already, but then V1 really does some more extra processing where it routes the movement information directly to MT, which is not like the classical layer 2-3 to layer 4 input. It's directly going from layer 4 to MT. It's not like it's object ID or something like that.
right.
And then similarly, there's some motion information going into V2, which seems to be extracting more like 3-dimensional motion. So that could be doing some extra pre-processing here.
Where's your concept of 2-dimensional motion?
Or this is more like shape-based motions. Like I think they did like experiments with dotted cylinders rotating or something like that. And then that's what would be detected in V2. I'm not sure if I have a slide on that one. And see if I can find that. Yeah, stuff like this kind of experiment where they have like a 3-dimensional shape, cylinder rotating. Not sure if this was the experiment that I'm thinking of, but basically more like shapes moving, a bit more complex movement patterns than what you would directly get on the retina with the magnocellular pathway.
So, I'm going to throw out another question for you. So with the behavior model versus the morphology model, I said, okay, we're going to separate these two out. There's going to be regions like MT that may be just behavioral models, and they can have a hierarchy of behavior models. It's like, okay, I'm going to process that separately, and I'm morphology model. So I have these two areas in the brain where I can see, okay, one's really modeling behaviors, one's really modeling non-behavioral static objects. And then, but now the surface model is a little weird because it's another static model, right? It's another, it's more like the morphology model. And it's not clear where I break that out and how where that would work, and are they interspersed among each other in the same V2 and V4? Are they separate areas?
I guess the best proposal I could come up with is that they could be the thin stripes and the pale stripes because they are like labeled as color and form. So they would
that
still
be would
the-
would you propose that this morphology and surface models continue throughout the cortex, or is it just a localized thing for, V2?
I don't think they would be everywhere. I mean, it would mostly be in visual cortex for sure. Like tactile, it doesn't make much sense to have a surface model because we don't have like
So
much.
let's say we're going up higher in regions of the cortex. We got all these different regions all the place. I've always imagined them being uniform. They're all cortical columns. They all do the same thing. But now we have three flavors now. We've got behavior, we have morphology, and we have surface. And so I can say, okay, maybe early on in the visual system, we have to do this because the visual system's got all this weird stuff going on. But what about other parts of the brain? Would they have similar sort of non-uniformities, similar sort of, breaking out into different types of columns? That gets pretty far away from Mountcastle's idea, right?
I mean, I think to me, it's exactly his idea because I feel like the same way auditory columns would be a different type of model because they get auditory input, and tactile columns would be a different type of.
I got it, but I understand your point there. But then again, okay, I have an auditory cortex and I have a hierarchy of auditory regions. I have a visual cortex and a hierarchy of visual regions. I have a MT. If we say MT is the where paths, I have as a behavior. I have a hierarchy of those. So again, those all fit like, oh yeah, they're all processing the same data in a hierarchy. They're getting different types of data. I'm just hung up on this morphology versus surface. That's the only thing that's really that's bothering me. That's the one I'm struggling with. I don't know what the equivalent of that is everywhere. It just seems like I don't know. It doesn't seem elegant yet to me.
Yeah, I wouldn't say they have to be everywhere. They might just be in like V1, V2 or so. And then, I mean, at higher regions, when we have like more abstract concepts, it would be again a more different type of, or you could call it again a different type of model because the movements are more in conceptual space.
Right, but you can easily imagine evolution has evolved a visual system that solves very specific visual problems. And and so, and we know that other mammals don't have a straight V1 and they must not see the same way we do. But it's kind of hard to, when I get to higher level conceptual ideas, the evolution wasn't really involved in what there has to be more of a generic solution for everything. Because we haven't been around to evolve the math section and the politics section and the whatever section.
Yeah, so that's what I mean. The columns are still exactly the same. They just now get different input, which in this case would be
right. But
highly
this different
processed
input,
input from other columns.
but this input, as you've shown here, these are specific mechanisms that had to be evolved to do this. These are not learned. These would have to be like evolution has discovered to do this processing in this striate layer 4 to solve a bunch of problems that are very specific. And this must have taken a long time to do.
Yeah, but this is the pre-processing part, like the extra layer 4s and the mechanism,
right.
The general mechanism in the columns would still be the generic one.
I got it, but when I get to some higher level conceptual ideas, I can't imagine there's a similar sort of pre-processing like this that's going on.
It's just that they would, instead of receiving direct sensory input, they receive highly processed output of other columns.
Right. But at some point, this sort of pre-processing stuff goes away. I'd have to have I would expect to see a much more uniform representation modeling in those upper layers. Otherwise, the only way we're getting in to get these stripes in visual layer 2 is because evolution's discovered, evolved mechanisms that are not generic, that are solved specific.
I mean, those stripes develop in early visual developments. Like if you're born with or if for some injury reason one of your eyes is blind during early visual development, you don't, for example, develop those stripes.
Right, but I don't think that's a strong argument. I mean,
I just mean the columns just specialize or just respond to whatever input they get, and if they don't
Right,
get
but that input
then-
has coming out of those blobs, as you've shown here, is not, that has to be genetically coded. I don't think, I mean, otherwise, if I only have these two types of signals coming in, parvo and magno, it is not at all clear how the brain would learn to separate them out like this and create these different types of inputs to the next region. It seems to make this has to be, and we don't see it in other animals. So this is a learned, genetically determined, I mean, a genetically evolved mechanism that's specific for vision. And obviously, if I damage one eye, things are going to go all haywire. Fine, that doesn't tell me anything really. But the question is, in the upper regions, would we have similar something equivalent? And if we did, then we would have to argue, well, how do those upper regions get different? You know, who processes the data to parse it out into different types of inputs? It just seems like it has to be more generic higher up.
Yeah, it likely is. I wouldn't argue against that. I guess, yeah, the argument I made last week that I agree that this kind of special layers and connectivity to MT is something that needs to be kind of pre-wired and genetically determined. But my thought was that, like, evolutionarily speaking, evolving that is still easier than evolving a second set of machinery in the column to model
That's
up.
fine. I'm okay with that. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is I've always been trying to find generic solutions, you know, that are universal. And so, but I've also known that that's not always going to be the case. And so the idea that we have, that you're making here, that maybe there's some very specific mechanisms that are not universal in V1 that does some very specific things for vision is appealing to me, actually. But I want to just call it out as such. I want to say there's a specific thing that only works for vision here. And when I think about, surface models versus morphology models, I think morphology models are universal. They're going to be everywhere in the cortex, up until, everywhere. But when these surface models, maybe that's something that's, vision only. And you made that argument like, well, this is a problem that, we have to deal with in vision objects. Maybe it doesn't apply in touch and audition. And it's only going to be done in early processing. And after that, it's gone. I could go for that. I think I like that idea, actually.
Yeah, that's how I would think of it, that's pretty specific to vision, and it's really
Okay, so
more.
maybe it was already in your mind, but this conversation is a way of sort of, when I first hear it, I go, that's not a generic solution. I don't like this because it's not a generic solution. It feels a very sort of hacky solution. And therefore, I don't like it as in terms of, the concepts of general principles of cortical operation. But if it's a hacky solution that only applies to vision and only in V1 and V2, well, then that may be good. Then it's a nice thing because we have an explanation for why we have V1, striated V1.
I think maybe it wasn't the best way to present it. Like, there are three types of models. I did that mainly because in past, like 2 years ago in brainstorming sessions, we would talk about, oh, there should be three types of models: behavior, features, and morphology. But framing it now, I think the main thing the main way I'm thinking of it is that there's only one type of learning module, one type of column, but then there are many different types of input they could get. And there's very modality specific pre-processing and routing that can happen to that, especially in.
Well, I think that's a better way of looking at it, right? Yeah, because when you say there's three types of model, that's not really true. There's one type of model that can be applied in different contexts, and then we can elaborate what those contexts are. And there might be some very specific contexts that apply to vision only. And then I would but if this is true, if there's really only, then I would really like to understand that even though I have created these sort of genetically driven differences, like different modalities in the striate V1, those are genetically determined differences, that somehow all these columns can work together. The way they communicate with each other in general is going to be exactly the same. And so I would expect to see, hierarchy work in both of these cases for all these compositionality. I would expect to see voting work in all these cases, independent of various things. This really, then there's really only one type of model, and we have to then specify. We have to understand where the different inputs come from, why there are different inputs. And then we also say, are there any unique ways they connect to each other because they represent different things? If they all connected together in the exact same ways, independent of whatever their inputs were, that would be best.
Yeah, so that's how I was thinking of it, that they are the same thing and the connectivity between them is the same way. They all can associate with each other hierarchically on a location by location basis. It doesn't matter for the column itself what input it gets. It always does the same thing with the input, mapping it as things at locations.
Yeah.
And there might be some special cases that like some connections don't exist between specific models because there's just no correlation. Like for example,
Right.
you might not have morphology model IDs associated with locations on a behavior model because those are not changing things. But
Right.
yeah.
Okay, so so I think, maybe this is all clear in your head, and I don't know if other people had the same confusion I had, but it did trip me up when you said there's 3 types of models, because I don't really like that. It's okay. I think we really have one type of model, and then we have to enumerate the ways in which the brain might create unique inputs to those models.
Yeah.
And so we've added one where we've just added one where we're separating out movement behaviors for behavioral models. You propose now maybe using the striate V1 to create different types of inputs for surface and 3D other types of models. We've already had different modalities. That's trivial. We've had that from the start. So those are the things we've gotten so far. And then it would be like to think like, okay, can I really mix and match these in hierarchy? Can I really mix and match these in voting? So if I'm going to be, figuring out composition, and I'm doing compositional models, can I, really not care at all whether my input's a behavior model or a morphology model or a feature model or, something else? That would be nice. That's what.
I think that should be the case, that you don't care.
Well, that's good. I have to, personally, I'm not as quick, so I need to think through that more. Think through the issues. So maybe this is a good breaking point. I know it's getting late.
Yeah.
But I think for me, just rephrasing that picture to show one learning module in different types of sources of input and where those sources of input come from that make them different, would have been a better way of presenting it in hindsight. Right, it's a better way of presenting it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I was kind of stuck with how I got to it, but
right. We get there historically from a certain direction, and that's why we end up with words and pictures that doesn't always map. But I think that's a far more interesting way. Then you could say that there really isn't. You may not even be able to enumerate all the different types of models there are. Like you had a morphology model of feed. You really can't necessarily enumerate them. You can say, well, there may be many others. We just don't know. These are the ones we think about. These are the kind of things that might occur. And then you could even ask yourself, well, what if I mix and match those inputs? What if I took a column and I gave it some different combinations of inputs that it might end up with some hybrid weirdness thing but it would still work. Right? That's an appealing idea.
Yeah, so that's kind of how I'm thinking about like how people classify the different regions in the brain and their different functionalities, is that those are all still the same columns, but they just get differently processed inputs. And so, yeah, like you said, there aren't just 3 models, there are many different types of things that
I
are
would say
possible
there's
in
only
modeling.
one modeling mechanism,
Yeah,
and it might be very difficult to actually explain what the model represents, but it will be determined on its inputs, and we can take a stab at some of them.
yeah.
Like, that's the way I always kind of viewed it. I've always viewed it like there's only one column, and you have different inputs, and it'll model whatever that input is. I think I always thought of that as different modalities, and now we're breaking it into finer distinction.
Yeah, so what I'm trying to get to in Monty is basically doing one more thing to the learning module, which is adding this state time conditioning component to the models. And then all the rest will be having different types of sensor modules, plugging in like sensor modules that detect changes or that detect different like movement along the surface instead of in 3D space.
But we have to be careful there, because no, that's the wrong language. That's our old language. We need to have different sources of input to the column, and sometimes those are different sensors. But in the case of vision, at least, we know that some of those will be calculated in layer 4. In V1.
Yeah, well, okay, yeah, I guess I was thinking of the extra layer 4s in V1 as just special sensor module processing.
But in that picture, the sensor goes to the thalamus, and that's not what we mean there, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Do we need to figure out how it's done in V1? How that separation between features and morphology is happening? Or is this, we're just gonna assume it's a...
Oh, we know V1's doing something, right? And we've always known that. So I think it would be nice if we could say, oh, here's how it calculates it. But I think that might, and you might be able to do that, Rami. I think I would find that very hard. Well, at least the last time I looked at the literature on the striate cells, it just blew my mind how complex it was, and the data was very confusing. And I think it would be better, the way I would approach this, and I'm not telling how you should approach it, but the way I would approach it, I would theoretically determine the kind of things that we needed to do, like we just did. Viviane suggested, okay, we need to calculate out movement inputs to do behavioral models. And then maybe we'll need to calculate different type of inputs to represent surface models or whatever, something like that. And then you can go back and look at the mechanisms in V2 or V1. But I don't think that would be the most fruitful thing to start with. I think the most fruitful thing to start with is this generic idea that we might need to calculate, we can calculate different types of variables, different types of inputs from the data. And then we have a common learning algorithm after that. And again, because from a Monty point of view, we might come up with other kind of extractions of the data. In some sense, this adds a whole new layer to Monty. It's a layer that says we have sensor modules, we have and then we have learning modules. And I think of a sensor module as a module that's actually attached to a sensor. But then we have like another layer that extracts information from sensors and turns it into different types of inputs to learning modules. And it's after the thalamus, so it's after the orientation transform in the case of V1.
My concern is that now we would have different, the columns in V1 and V2, they'd be doing different things. They would not be generic, because one is doing pre-processing and preparing some inputs to V2, but V2 now is a generic learning model.
Right. Well, but we know that really it does exist. We know that there is this non-generic V1. It's got twice as many cells per column. It's thicker. It's got these extra layers. We know that this non-generic thing exists. So here's the way I might make a little picture. I would say we have sensors like eyes and ears and skin. They get pre-processed, then, at least in terms of auditory and tactile, they get some pre-processing. Then they all go through the thalamus, because they all have to have their orientation compensated for, because they are egocentric things. Then we have some beyond the thalamus, beyond that, we call those multi-layers in V1. We have additional processing, which now extracts out various variables that we can now send to different types of columns, different learning modules that then will learn different aspects of the visual space. And that is also non-generic. That's an extra layer of processing that's occurring. So our general Monty system would include sensor modules that actually go through an orientation change and other inputs which get from someplace, whether it's from V1, it's in V1 or it's some subcortical thing that generate additional types of information that can be sent to columns, and the columns will learn whatever it is. I don't know if I'm not sure if that's helpful or not.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of it a bit simpler in Monty, that we wouldn't add any extra machinery. Like, I mean, maybe it evolved to happen in extra layers in V1, but conceptually, I feel like it can still be processing in the sensor module in Monty, and then just be sent to the learning module. The learning module contains the thalamus basically anyways. So I guess...
Well, it's possible, but think about this, Viviane. Two possible, you might want to do it that way. One thing is that, in my mind, the sensors themselves have to go through the thalamus for an orientation change, and clearly that's not happening with calculations after in Striate V1. And also, we might be getting inputs from parts of the brain that are not classic sensors. So if you want to call it a sensor module, maybe you call it an input module or something like that, because when you use the word sensor module, I imagine attached to a physical sensor, and that sensor is moving in the world. But maybe, because we're now talking about these inputs that are being extracted after the sensor module. In some sense, the sensor in the brain, it's in V1, Striate V1. Well, that's up to you. That is an operational and organizational detail that you can decide to do one way or the other in Monty. You can expand the definition of a sensor module to include these other features that are not just attached to a sensor, or you could create an extra layer of processing to do this. I don't care, but if you do the former, I would really be careful not to use. Maybe you want to modify the word sensor, because to me that means something very specific. If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Well, I said we're gonna end here. I think this is great progress. I really do. I think this is great progress, and it sounds like what I think what we've done here today is we've taken these ideas that are in your head, Viviane, and challenge. At least this is what I've been doing. I mean, challenging them with the idea to get better clarity on them, because I didn't see them as clearly perhaps as you did, and so and I'm trying to put words around it so that it makes more sense to me, and maybe other people too. So I think it's been very fruitful. I don't know.
I think my takeaway is going to be just to consider V1 as an extension of the thalamus, or some.
I'm careful about that.
I would call it as like additional pre-processing of the sensory data and routing.
Well, in the biology, it's really clear. You have sensor organs. They can have some pre-processing or not. In auditory and tactile, they have a pre-processing steps. In vision, they go right to the thalamus. So you can have some pre-processing or not. In maybe the pre-processing in the visual system is in the retina itself. Okay, so we have pre-processing. You have the actual sensory sensors. You have pre-processing. It can go through the thalamus for orientation changes. And then beyond that, at least in the case of V1, there's additional processing before it gets routed to the actual learning modules. That's how I would view it from a biological point of view. That's what the evidence would suggest.
I think it's reasonable because we were saying also the output from V1 goes to MT directly sometimes for behavior. So it looks like a shared module that just pre-processes stuff for
that was always a little bit of a mystery, because why didn't the the retina just project directly to MT, right? You know, why was it bundled together in the V1? That was always like a weird thing. I don't understand that, but
Yeah, I'm still not, I mean, we can wrap up this meeting, but I'm also still not sure what exactly is happening here when like the magnocellular input goes into layer 4C alpha, but then it goes into layer 4B, and from there it gets routed to V2 and MT. So if there's like what kind of processing is happening here, and if that's in any way connected to models that are being learned in V1 in like layer
you
6.
know, well, maybe the data is good, but my experience with these things is when people say this projects here or this goes there or the information flow is this way, it's very problematic, and you just have to take it as only one idea. And you know, like, how do they determine that? Where are these cells actually connecting? Do they, you know, what kind of connections are they making? I mean, there's just so much crap that goes on here, and these cells have thousands and thousands of synapses. So I always take that a little bit of a grain of salt, like, okay, you know, unless I have a very specific hypothesis that I'm testing, then I can look at that data and I can try to extract out does the data validate or invalidate the hypothesis. But
Yeah, I was just trying to think if this is just like a feed forward kind of relay thing that's happening, or if there's any actual processing and incorporating information that's modeled in V1.
Oh, I don't know. I guess I don't know. I'm just the way we were just talking about a minute ago. It was like it's just feed forward pre-processing.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not true. It would be in some sense those transformations we were talking about, extracting out motion, extracting out the different types of inputs. Those seem to be model-free calculations.
Yeah.
So therefore, they would be in just like the thalamus is model-free calculations, and so is the retina, and so is the inferior colliculus audition. Those are all model-free calculations. So I'm
Yeah, so
assuming.
that's why I'm wondering that, because if it is all model free, then there's no point in having that as part of a special learning module. Then it is basically like a sensor module pre-processing information. So I'm just
Right.
wondering
Except I
why
made
it
the
has to be.
distinction in you may have to pre-process before you get to the thalamus, and the thalamus is an orientation changer, and you may need to do pre-processing after that. So I just so that is that all, you know, and maybe the stuff is not coming from a sensor, maybe it's coming from someplace else in the brain. So I just feel like calling it a sensor module, it's a little too simplistic. There's a lot that could go on in that. So you can still call it a sensor module, but we have to be very, very clear that it may have very little to do with, you know, a lot of what it's doing. It may unrelated to particular sensors, or maybe, I don't know, you know.
Yeah.
I think it would also be interesting to think about whether the striate cortex, V1, striate V1 is also building models of objects, complete models of objects, or at this point it's just pre-processing inputs for.
No, but it has all the other layers, Rami. It still has the layer 6s and the layer 5s and the layer 3s and all that stuff. So I always viewed it as the evolution's stuck in some extra machinery here before it goes to the rest of V1 or anywhere else. It's like it's almost like you could have imagined it like a little box between the thalamus and the cortex, pre-processing this data. And so I imagine the V1 columns still are modeling objects. I don't see why they wouldn't.
Yeah, I would say so too. Like there's all this other stuff still happening. So what I was kind of arguing here was that there are still like morphology models and maybe surface models in V1, but the extra layer 4s are basically like a little pre-processing and feed forward step directly to MT. But it's not much interconnected with the models that are in like the L6 and 4 associative connections.
Okay, so we didn't really lose a level of the hierarchy. It's still.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
It's just this weirdo thing, you know. Well, I like this a lot, actually, despite all my objections today. I think this is we ended up in a really, really better place. At least it feels that way right now. So I want to understand how you can mix and match these different types of models where they really are mix and matchable. Once you've gotten past this weird sort of pre-processing step in the, and now, you know, maybe one model's learning this kind of thing, another model's learning something else. Can you really mix and match them? Can you feed both into hierarchies? And I don't know, just, you know, we don't want to carry along this distinction very far. It's okay to have the differences in the very beginning. But because it's really modality specific. But after that, you don't really want to do that.
Yeah, I guess after that it quickly becomes just object IDs, child object IDs. So it shouldn't be that big of a distinction anymore.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way. I need to think about it more.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that we got a better understanding.
Yeah, and then I feel
ideas.
remiss that I didn't understand your whole concept of how
I feel
what
like
layer 5, layer 6B was
my-
doing.
Yeah, my final goal of the, like, once we figure out all the questions in the theory, the final goal will be to figure out how you can explain a model that you have in your head to someone else who has
Right.
different models. That's like
Yeah, we have a big
so
education.
difficult.